Good evening, friends. Before we start, there is a little ritual that Akshay has agreed to perform. So I request Akshay to do that ritual and then we can go into our discussion.
नमस्कार धन्यवाद आपण मानक समस्तु जो तो बही दुकान में आपण माने आसिकरी किछि गोटे छोट उत्सव पालन करछन्ती. It's very essential that you please remember that these spaces are also part of the culture, because this is where you get to meet, you get to share whatever you like, and also the opportunity for all of us to see it. Thank you so much जे आपण मते इंट्रोड्यूस करेले आउ सुमन्यु को कथा हेले इटा करबा पे. We will be very happy to hear from एटा गोटे छोटिया काम छे आपण को पे. बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद. Thank you. And आपण बही दुकान बही किनिबे. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hello, good evening. Beholden to Akshay Babu for having lent his space to us. The idea came from Chandrahas, our mutual friend, and of course Himansu, my friends. And when Akshay Babu immediately agreed to host this small event, I got to understand there is an audience which supports this particular culture that you are talking about. And in Milton's words, fit though few, the audience. I'm grateful to Akshay Babu, and I must thank all of you for having found the time. This is a place which for most people is quite far off. And we are especially, we feel honored in the presence of Nivedita and Omkar Babu. As all of you know, Nivedita has done some pioneering work. We are all Johnny come lately insofar as Odisha studies is concerned. She had done the groundwork, and I feel personally, when you survey the field, I don't think that anybody has surpassed the kind of archival work when the archives were not digitized. They were, in the real sense of the term, in the true sense of the term, archives on which she worked. And the books that she has produced, which has gone into a reprint, every serious-minded scholar of Odisha studies, no matter what the discipline is, has to consult that. So we really feel honored, in our presence. And when it's not easy for anyone to read an academic book of this kind, but my friend Himansu took the trouble of reading this, and he immediately thought of an event like this. Of course, the original proposal came from Chandraji, and thank you, Akshay Babu.
So thank you, Sumanyu, and once again I welcome the audience who are present here. Small audience, close-knit audience, and that is how we like it. Thank you, Sumanyu, for agreeing to this. I know that you were not supposed to come to Bhubaneswar at this time, but then you were very excited when I proposed this idea to you, and Akshay readily agreed. So once again, I thank Akshay for providing this wonderful space to us. Sumanyu wants to gift a copy of the book to Akshay.
Thank you so much
for this.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. Now all of you know Professor Sumanyu Satpathy is a former professor of English and head of the Department of English, University of Delhi. He is a first-rate academic, an excellent researcher, a very fine critic, a very perceptive critic, and I have known Sumanyu for almost 50 years. Our journeys actually began as fellow cricketers. Of course, he was senior to me and we were playing cricket, but never ever I thought in my wildest dreams that we would also be interlocutors on a very heavy academic subject like this. But then cricket is something that you can play only in your youth. You can't do it later. But you can go on reading all your life. So fortunately, as English teachers, as English academics, we have shared a lot of things in common. And Sumanyu has also visited the Department of English a number of times when I was in the department, and I was also heading the department. I know that Sumanyu's work, it has gone in a very interesting trajectory. Up to 90s, late 1990s, his work was solidly in the mainstream of English studies. For example, he wrote his MPhil dissertation on the reception of modernist poetry in Times Literary Supplement. It's a very interesting work. Nobody actually thought about that kind of work in English studies in the 1980s. He was an MPhil scholar in University of Hyderabad, and that was his topic. It was supervised by Meenakshi, Professor Vishwanathan. So that was his first work, and then he continued that work. For his PhD, he chose T.S. Eliot, and he examined not T.S. Eliot's poetry so much, but his work as an editor of that little magazine called The Criterion. So T.S. Eliot's editorship of The Criterion was his PhD topic. But after 1990s, his work registered a very significant shift. From the mainstream English studies, he moved homeward. I would say homeward. He worked on nonsense verse and established nonsense as the 10th Rasa. And then he worked on Indian English writing, on translation, on queer theory in relation to, India, of course. But last 3 decades, he has been working on Odisha, on Odia literary culture, and 3 books have resulted from this very passionate, very intense engagement. First is Reading Literary Culture, 2008, and then in 2017, I think, Will to Argue, and now this is the book, the latest in his Odyssey in Odisha Studies, Modernity, Print and Sahitya, the Making of a New Literary Culture, 1866 to 1919. So first of all, let me congratulate Sumanyu on this wonderful work. I like this work especially because this provides a bridge between English studies and vernacular studies, studies of vernacular languages in India. And it also tells us how, as English professors, we can redefine, reinvent ourselves without letting go of English, without letting go of the discourses of Euro-modernity or European modernity, how we can enrich and energize our own literary culture. So he has shown a way to do that, and it's really very instructive. So I read this book last month, and I was really bowled over by this. Not only the amount of research or the quality of research that has gone into this book, but also the fine analysis that has gone into it. So the book, let me just briefly introduce to you the book. It is 1866. It starts with 1866. These 2 markers are very important. 1866, as you know, is a very significant year in Odisha's history, not because simply of Naanka Durbhiksha, but also because the first weekly newspaper was published in 1866, Utkala Deepika, edited by Gauri Shankar. And that was possible because in 1865, the Odia elite started owning the printing press for the first time. The printing press came to Odisha in 1835, but that was managed and run by the missionaries. In 1866, the Odia elite were the owners of the printing press. So that certainly precipitated the growth in periodicals, newspapers. So he has chosen 1866 as the initiating year, and 1919, that is another very, very important year. This is the year which saw the publication of the oldest Odia Delhi, Samaj, the Samaj was, it began publishing in the year 1919, and just 4 years before that, Gopabandhu Das brought out Satyavadi, another periodical, very famous periodical. So he has tried to look at the period in between 1866 and 1919, which saw some very interesting developments. The print, the print public sphere came into prominence during this time. Lots of newspapers, lots of journals were published. For example, Prabodh Chandrika, the first secular journal in Odia, at sometime in 1860s, I think, late 60s, and the first literary journal in 1873, Utkala Darpana, Utkala Madhupa, and of course the most important of all, in 1897, Utkal Sahitya, and it remained in force for almost 50 years, 1997 to 1952. And that was a monthly newspaper. That is where most of the important Odia works that we know today were serialized. So he brings this investigation to a close in 1919 simply because his project is to define modernity in its initial phase. How modernity came to Odia literature through print and through this negotiation with European education, which also came in a big way at that time, and how as a result of this negotiation between the indigenous aesthetics that we had in Odisha, in India, it's a long 400-year-old history, and how European modernity entered into very interesting negotiation with it, collision with it, and a new literature was created. So that was the Adhunik literature. So he has gone into the details of this, and there are 5 chapters in his book, and these 5 chapters document the growth of Odia modernity, but he has not taken a chronological view. I mean, it's not a chronological sequential analysis. He has tackled this in terms of 4 different themes. For example, how initially literature became a curricular requirement, how literature came because of curricular requirement in schools. Okay, and the school textbooks, the school needed textbooks. So at the time, Bengali textbooks predominated. There were not enough Odia textbooks. Out of 300 textbooks, maybe 3 were written by Odias. So once literature became a curricular requirement, there was a need for Odia writers to also produce textbooks. So that is how Odia textbooks increased in number and gradually displaced the Bengali books. That was one angle, where Sahitya became important, but it was not Sahitya in the sense in which we understand today. It is not just imaginative composition, not just creative composition. All kinds of things were subsumed under Sahitya. And then another important aspect was there was this new phenomenon called taste or ruchi. This ruchi that came mainly from English education. That we need to be refined, we need to be civilized, we need to be bhadraloks, and accordingly we should reflect that decency, that restraint in our literature. So as a result of that, the word medieval is not used, he says here. Prachin poets, the Prachin literature, ancient literature began to be discredited. Right? And that was another source of the rise of modernity. So then there was another very interesting concern about, Odisha was dismembered, as you know. Odisha was dismembered, and part of it was with Bengal presidency, part of it was with the Madras presidency, and part of it was with the central provinces Berar, and there were all autonomous Garjats, right? So there was a need to unify the Odia-speaking tracts. So, modernity was also imagined along the lines of unification of Odisha. That's why, during this time, it was not so much the pan-Indian nationalistic consciousness which dominated literary production. It was rather the impulse to unify the Odia-speaking tracts, the Odia nationalism, to consolidate Odia Jati, Odia Desa, Odia community. And because of that, there was a need on the part of intelligentsia, on the part of the reading public, to lay claim to whole of Odisha, not just the Moghalbandi areas, but the whole of Odisha, and travel writing emerged as a very important genre. Then, of course, the idea of, that Odia had a very glorious past. It has now suffered decline because of British occupation, because of Bengali dominance. The need to imagine a brighter future for Odisha. So that was another source of this new literary modernity. So all these things came together to forge the new modern literature, Adhunik literature. So this is very briefly, I have given a very bold and bare summary of the book. But I would request Sumanyu to give you a more sort of sustained and a more objective and saner account of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Himansu, for that wonderful introduction to me and to the book that's being discussed now. One of the things that you said when you began was the trajectory of my research and my interest from modernism, European, British modernism to Odisha studies. How did this happen? It wasn't a complete severance between the two, as you said. It's a continuity. When I joined the University of Delhi, I offered 2 courses. Modernism continued to be my bread and butter. I ran 2 courses called intertextualities, modern and postmodern, where most of the texts and theories were European British, but there are also an element of Indian intertextual texts. The other one was sexual dissidence and modernism. So again, there is modernism which comes in. But because I came into Delhi University and we had colleagues like Sisir Kumar Das, Harish Trivedi, Namwar Singh, all these people, and then that was the high tide of post-colonial theory. So I wanted to travel the whole hog. One of the earliest focuses or foci, you can say, insofar as Odisha was concerned, was Gopinath Mohanty's Poroja and Todopa. Because I was, I had to be self-reflexive as a teacher. When I'm talking about Chinua Achebe's critique of Things Fall Apart, and, his attack on Conrad as a bloody racist, because, of a particular kind of portrayal of Black Africa. So I thought, why is Mahashweta Devi doing it? And I heard from different sources that Mahashweta Devi herself was, grateful to Gopinath Mohanty, who taught her a thing or two about, the indigenous population of Odisha. So I looked at Tadpa, I looked at Poroja. These were the early years of my attention, moving away from English modernism, not totally moving away, but reorienting my focus. If that is Orientalism, if that is post-colonial, what is this? What happens when an Odia middle class elite travels to, the jungles of Paraja? So this was one of my early interests. Gradually, I moved further. And because there was a lot of interdisciplinary interaction at the university, we had historians like Shahid Amin and many others. That is when I was drawn to, I said, if I want to do Odisha studies, how can I not be familiar with Odisha history, the modern Odisha? So that is where Nivedita, this book came in handy, and that was one of my early inspirations. So gradually I moved further, deeper and deeper. Then in the meantime, what was happening elsewhere was studies modern Bengal coming out from the works of Sudipta Kaviraj, Partha Chatterjee, Dipesh Chakrabarti, and so on and so forth. Then you had the works of Vasudha Dalmia, Francisca Orsini in the Hindi public sphere, on the Hindi public sphere. Then we had Lisa Mitchell from the Telugu angle. Now, what occurred to me is that they all somehow elided Odisha, because the period they are talking about, as Himansu pointed out, Calcutta Presidency also included a significant chunk of Odisha. But there is no mention of Odisha in these works that Tanika Sarkar, she is talking about Indian women, etc., but Indian means only Bengali. So similarly, Vasudha Dalmia, there are many Odias from Western Odisha like Raja Vikram Dev and others who knew Hindi very well. They translated Bharat Durdasha, turning it into Odisha Durdasha, relocating, but literal translation. Then of course Lisa Mitchell's work, where she is saying that a significant chunk of southern Odisha also had Telugu population. So she is claiming on behalf of the Telugus this south of Odisha. Little did she worry or bother about how many Odias in south of Odisha were also writing and contributing to Telugu literary sphere. Many. So I thought, no, let me look at it. All these wonderful books, no doubt, wonderful studies, but they also need a corrective. And the idea led to this particular book. It's not a narrow focus on Odisha. It's not a parochial kind of attention to Odisha, unlike these books. It's constantly in dialogue with what was happening elsewhere in Bengal or Calcutta Presidency, Madras Presidency, and we are talking about Bengali textbooks. What about Odisha? In southern Odisha, they were studying, they had to study Telugu, learn Telugu. So that is the genesis of the book. But what I have done here is, I have not gone into a linear history. There are many issues. I saw that there are some conceptual, that we need to have some conceptual clarity. Because apart from these English books, I had to look at the humongous amount of work carried out by stalwarts like Notavar Samantai, Sudarsanacharya, Devendra Babu, Gaganendra Babu. A lot of work they had done on Odia literature, using terms like Sahitya, using terms like Adhunika, Ruchi Parivartana, and so on and so forth. Now I thought there is some confusion somewhere. So my first take was on Adhunika. How does Adhunika, the term Adhunika, come in? There's so much of work over the last 20 years, Nivedita, and you know, modernity studies all over the world. And our own Satyapi Mahanti also has written a lot of stuff on vernacular modernity. That is how what we call modernity is not Eurocentric or Euro-modernity. There is a kind of indigenous modernity which we must explore. I did not go into that. You know, where she is talking about, what is that, Purana? Lakshmi Purana and so on and so forth. I said, no, I'm not going to look at vernacular modernity. I'm going to look at modernity in the vernacular. And it is clear, those of us who are looking at modernity studies, it's clear that, you know, in Odisha, we recklessly use the term Adhunik for everything. Radhanath is also Adhunik, Gopinath Mohanty is Adhunik, Ramakant Rath, Sachi Rautray, all. But Adhunik or modern in Europe, modernity has a longer pedigree going back to the 16th and 17th century, and what is known as modern, and that is not literary modernity, but philosophical, where ratiocination, enlightenment project of the 18th century, the improvement narrative, and everything that happened, Kant and Hegel, and students should know what was happening in the 18th century, the emergence of the public sphere, and so on and so forth. So what is happening to Odisha? That is where Nivedita's book helped me. I found that after 1866, with the setting up of the indigenous printing press, these discourses gain strength. So Odia public sphere, Francisca Orsini, Vasudha Dalmia, they are talking about Hindi public sphere. But did a Odia public sphere emerge? Without the public sphere, there can be no modernity. And if there is no modernity in the philosophical sense, we cannot think of literary modernity. I noticed, this is just one small thing about Adhunik. I saw that our own dictionaries say, Amarkosh in Sanskrit did not have an entry in Sanskrit, Adhunik. It had Adhuna, it had, 6 synonyms. It's like a thesaurus. And it was translated by Amos Sutton, the missionary, in 1844 or 45. There also there is no mention of Adhunik for modern. Adhuna is there, there are again 6 or 7 synonyms. So, but when Amos Sutton wrote a dictionary, Odia dictionary, 2 or 3 years later, there is an entry, Adhunik. And that Adhunik Dha is Dirgho, which clearly shows that this is a new coinage, because the Europeans needed to use this term called modernity in Odia. So, if you, and the paper, Utkal Deepika, for the first 2 years, did not use the term Adhunik. Navya, etc., these other synonyms were being used. Gradually, they also started using, particularly in Utkal Darpan came up in 1873, you see more and more instances of Adhunik. When Pyarimohan Acharya wrote his history of Odisha in Odia, the last chapter, Adhunika Juga, he doesn't call it Adhunika Juga, Bartaman Juga or something he calls it. Okay. So Adhunika took a long time to establish itself. And so my take on, Dipesh Chakrabarty uses a term, the muddle of the modern, that European philosophers have been struggling. They have coined the word Adhunik, modern or modernity, but they have not, there is no common, no consensus on what exactly as a philosophical concept, what exactly does it mean. So he uses the term, the muddle of the modern. And I find in Odia literary criticism or history, Adhunik similarly is a huge muddle. Similarly, Sahitya and other words. So, in chapter after chapter, I begin in the first chapter introduction, some 1 or 2 pages dedicated to these concepts, but they recur, and I develop these concepts, over time up to 1919 and beyond. So, before I go on and on like this, let me stop and hand it over.
Thank you, Sumanyu. Very fine. I think, in your book you have said that Tarinicharan Ratha used the word Adhunik, as a prefix before literature or before the present age for the first time in the literary history history of Odia literature that he wrote. And earlier, as you said, there was this uncertainty about the specific term to be used, Bartaman Juga and Navya, Nutan, and so on and so forth. So, that shows that the word Adhunik, or the sensibility that this word refers to, got stabilized at that time. It tried to convey a specific sense of a break with the past. There was a break with the past. So I would like you to just tell us a little bit about that break, because that break with the past was the break. It's a very big break, because it is it's a break with 400 years of indigenous aesthetics. In fact, you have said very clearly in the introductory chapter that Sahitya was defined in Indian aesthetics in terms of rasa, in terms of bakrokti, in terms of the union of word and sense, and also alankara to beautify it. So that had a tremendous hold on the tradition of Kavya. Okay, so how is it that this strong and very powerful tradition was dismantled in a matter of a couple of decades? And what came in its place? What came in its place? I mean, when I ask you this question, I am also thinking about the mutations in the term modernism in the English context, in the British context. Modernism, of course, modernism is not the same as modernity. We know that. But modernism, there was a lot of, uncertainty about which term to use for the poetry or the prose that Eliot, Pound, and Joyce were writing. So at first they, tried to call it imagism. Then they tried to call it vorticism. And then finally, the word modernism came to stay. So there is a similar problem here with both Sahitya and also modernity. So could you throw a little bit of light on how this break came? Was it because of the influence of European education? Was it because of this pull towards scientific temper, pull towards the modern sensibility? Because I think you say at the end of your book that Gopabandhu was the first modern poet, because he was a poet who was able to integrate an agent of modernity, namely the train, into the description of natural landscape. For example, he is writing about Chilika, but it starts with his journey in the train. Raha raha khyone baspiyo sakata. And that Gopabandhu. Rado upare Chilika darshan. Raha raha khyone baspiyo sakata dekhibi Chilika charu chitrapata. And you contrast that with Radhanath's poem on Chilika, which was a very romantic evocation of Chilika. And when I read that, I was immediately reminded of how, for example, Dickens modernized the English prose in 1857 in his novel Hard Times. Okay, in Hard Times there is a passage where the passage says, there is this woman who is able to imagine an adulterous relationship between James Harthouse and Louisa. Okay, but then Dickens tries to explain it in these terms, that this was clear to her mind as the electric telegraph wire that ruled a colossal bit of music paper out of the evening sky was clear to her eyes. So that, David Craig, who writes the introduction to the Penguin edition, says that this imagery is simply absolutely modern. It could not have come in Victorian period. Telegraph wire, and comparing that with the dark, probing into something. So, I was immediately reminded of that. Gopabandhu is amalgamating or integrating the train, the machine into the garden. Okay, so could you throw a little bit of light on that?
You did well to link it to, English or British modernity. So again, I'm belaboring this point in this book. Constantly, I'm saying that when we are talking about the modern, initially, we are not talking about modern poetry or modern literature per se. Modernism has been defined by some scholar, as many of you would know, is in a very crude sort of way, but I like it very much. Modernism in the arts generally, that is painting, whether it is Picasso or music, Stravinsky and drama and all this, even opera. When modernity enters the aesthetic field, that work of art is modern or modernist. But what is modernity? How did it happen? So, many journals that I studied, I was looking at, there are various facets of the modern or modernity, like the machine, the arrival of the machine, the arrival of telephone, electricity, balloon. In Cuttack, they held exhibitions of the balloon, gas balloon. And Gopal Puraras writes about what is the use of these inventions. Man used to fly even in India, like now we are doing in Ramayana and Mahabharata, the flying machines. But then again, he comes up with a writer, he says, yeah, but they are only works of imagination. No one has seen in India, there is no proof that there were flying machines. So at the same time, he is skeptical about the experiment of the balloon. This is late 19th century. In Cuttack, when they held this exhibition, there were ticketed shows, but people in Cuttack are very clever. They said, we can see the balloon going up from anywhere. Why do you have to go there and buy a ticket for it? So and education, the printing press, when all of us know how when Fakir Mohan started his printing press, many people went and saw it. Unfortunately, he was duped by the Bengali seller. It was not in a working condition. But he over a story. He said, look, only when this dries up, there are black patches. He says, when this dries up, you will see the letters. But this didn't happen. All these. So, then the court of law. Then there were newspaper articles about what were the court cases. Then there are banks. Then there are questions of divorce. So many aspects of the modern, many of these were unknown. And then the caste system, Brahmo meant the decimation of the caste system. By then, from Western India, Maharashtra, there were all these activists. And there are people who are saying that, even Gopal Proraj is saying that in the railway trains and railway stations, we can see people of the lower caste mingling with people of the higher caste. So the caste discourse, even Dalit scholars like my friend Rajkumar, they always begin with Ambedkar. But there is a lot of caste discourse before that. When Radhanath wrote his unfinished epic called Mahajatra, he puts all the blame on the Brahmins. He said they are the ones who brought in the caste system. The Buddha had come and he had gotten rid of caste system. And again Brahmins dominated after 200 years or so. Again caste system came in. That is why the Arya Jati has fallen. This is Radhanath's take. And there are all these Brahmins from Puri who wrote numerous letters to the editors, Sambalpuri Hiteshani and all that. So these are the various aspects of the new kinds of newness. This is how Sudipta Kaviraj defines the modern of the European modern or modernity studies, the new kind of newness. Say when the Mughals came or even before that, there were changes in society. But they were not called modern. And there, whatever was Adhuna or Navya, it was just a temporal shift. It is not a conceptual shift of what is modern or what is Adhunik. So, by looking at 20 years of Utkal Darpan and many other, a lot of discursive writing, people are grappling with this. And gradually you can see that they are unable to find the right word to express what is this new kind of newness. That is when Adhunik comes in. This is what I find in several chapters. Now, if this is Adhunik, one of the ideas of modern was again the emergence of labor and leisure. People would go to office in Cuttack, it was a capital city, so people used to go at 10 o'clock and come back. So there were days like Sunday when there was no work, so they got leisure. So labor and leisure. So you find concepts like in clock time. The emergence of map, they got hold of what is happening. Maps and, earlier we are only talking about Prahara, Dvipahara and so on and sunset. This is how we measure time, but the calendar comes in. Then the clock time. So the year 1900, when the calendar shifted from 1899 to 1900, Gopabandhu wrote a poem about the coming of the new year. Can you believe it? So this is the new year. The moment he is talking about the new year, he is thinking of the passage of time. And he says what Odisha was. Baravati Stadium was like this. Baravati Fort was like this, and etc., etc. So he has a whole collection of poems, like Fakir Mohan had before him, Abasara Basare. The whole idea of Abasara. If there is no work, there is no Abasara. Then Gopabandhu writes, Abakaso Chinta. When he is...
Does the Abasara mean leisure?
Yes, Abasara.
Does it mean retirement?
Abasara, there is now only Abasara is retirement, but Abasara, in times of leisure.
Because a retired person doesn't have a distinction between work and leisure.
So, this is how the modern comes in. And then the compass. The epigraph that I have, there are two epigraphs. One is from Bacon. That epigraph from Novum Organum, 1618 Novum Organum, Bacon is saying that three items, one is compass, print and gunpowder. They have changed the face of the world, he says. Now 200 years later, a school inspector is saying in Odisha in English. In his annual report, he is saying that now we have shifted from palm leaf writing and all that to chalk and board and then printed books. So what I'm saying is almost 200 years after Francis Bacon's statement, how print has changed the world, most of these schools, modern European schools set up in India, Odisha, on the colonies, did not have printed books. Now, this is the second part, the arrival of advent of print, which is part of modernity. And then Sahitya, how both these impacted the emergence of a new kind of Sahitya. But just one more thing, the question that you asked is the question that Natavar Samantarai was advised by, what is his name, Acharya, this historian, Paramananda Acharya. He says, Mu kemiti gaveshana kali. He says, Paramananda Acharya told him, look, what is the kind of literature that, this is in the late 1940s. What was the kind of literature that was being written in Odisha and what before Radhanath and Fakirmon, and then suddenly the new kind of literature. How did this happen? Have you asked this question to yourself? He said you can answer this question by looking at the journals, how this shift happened. Then Natavar Samantarai in his book, he has this answer that it is with the introduction of European education and the task of writing textbooks that ensured the shift from the traditional kind of literature to Adhunika Odia literature. As you know, Madhusudan Rao, Radhanath Rai, they all wrote textbooks. But I am taking it a little further. I am saying that it is not only about textbooks. There is a public sphere which emerges. And what is good literature, what is desirable literature, what is new kind of taste, all these things are debated in the public sphere, literary sphere. Then, there is a connection between school curriculum and the public sphere. There are all these journals which are coming up. And many of the teachers or people who are interested in textbook writing were also stakeholders in print culture. Fakirmon was running a press, Radhanath, if not running a press, he was in charge of some periodicals in one from Baripada, Utkal Prabha. So they are all stakeholders. So there is a lot of politics. It's not that, towards what happens here, many administrative officers ensured, who are also writers, ensured that their poetry or prose was part of the curriculum. Radhanath was the first person who ensured that the new kind of poetry that he was writing, his colleagues were writing, has to be the new trend. So that is the shift that happens. And Natavar Samantarai had done a lot of work on this, very detailed work, but I am taking it a little further.
Thank you, Sumanyu, for this elaborate explanation. By the way, if you read this book, you will find that Natavar Samantarai is one of the great heroes for Sumanyu, because he has actually done pioneering work in archival work and studying the journals and basically trying to set up the two major paradigms for Odia literature to emerge. One is what is called, he calls a material distress. Material distress is the non-kadurvikya, and the other is what he calls the, I'm using your word there, affecting distress. That the anguish and the suffering of Odias because of Bengali domination. So these two distresses together propelled this growth of modern consciousness, modern literary consciousness. Now, another thing I would like to explain to you a little bit about this wonderful methodology that is at work in his book. Take, for instance, how we students of English literature or Odia literature, how do we read literature? Basically, we read literature through a canon of great works. For English literature students, it is a canon from, let us say, Chaucer to the latest. Could be, let us say, we have gone beyond T.S. Eliot now. So this canon of great work is our introduction to literature. We take that for granted. That is not looking at this vast undercurrent public sphere activity. That is where things have not yet completely taken shape. Things have not become crystallized or articulated. They're still in motion. They're still in solution. So these are the things that he looks at, and I'll give you one example. from chapter 3, Reappraisals and Renewals, Prachin versus Adhunik. It's a wonderful chapter, and I think just before we end the discussion, he will read a little bit from that. So there he begins with a very interesting sentence from chapter 5 of Chamana Athagund, where he says, he is describing Champa, the anti-heroine of this novel. And then he says, just as in Kabbik tradition, there was Naika's beauty was being described in detail. So Fakir-Mohan sets out to describe the Naika, but then suddenly he stops short because he cannot describe female anatomy, because there is a ban on that. There is a new import called ruchi or taste, which prevents him from going into the details of female anatomy. So now, supposing we look at this idea of ruchi as an foreign import, we stop there. If we read Sumanyu's book, we know the vast groundswell of activity that was going on in Odisha at that time, in Odisha public sphere, that, there were a whole group of poets associated with 2 journals, let us say, Utkala Dipika, Indradhanu, and Utkala Madhupa. They were all upholding the virtues of the Kabbik tradition. They thought that that was the way literary description should continue. There was nothing obscene about it. There is nothing, indecent about it. Now, opposed to that, there was another group of journals headed by, I think, Bijuli. Isn't it Bijuli? They said, no, this is bad, this is obscene. So, he has gone into not only just a descriptive account of this, but he has also gone into the history of that. For example, how this resentment against ruchi or taste came basically from Victorian morality through the via media of the Brahmo discourse. So that is how Fakir-Mohan Senapati is both alluding to it, but at the same time, he is subtly subverting that. So Fakir-Mohan is a very important figure because he officially acknowledges that, he cannot describe Champa's beauty because of this, restriction on detailed description. But at the same time, he very subtly suggests that there are a lot of things that we can describe, but then we cannot describe. So it is not just Fakir-Mohan, but also Ramshankar Rai, in one of his books, he also does the same thing. So this is one of the virtues of this book, that he doesn't simply take you to the great works, but he takes us behind and around and beneath the great works to what was happening in the culture at that time. That is one, and I'll give you another example. You might elaborate on that. In all of Fakir-Mohan's very large oeuvre, very large corpus of works, there is only one single instance of an epigraph, a quotation in English. Only one, Rebati, the first successful modern Odia short story. Rebati has an English epigraph, often that April morn is hour and blackest grief on joyous homes may unseen may lower, like that. And you have only one source indicated there, Reverend J.H. Gurney. So Fakir-Mohan has taken the quote from Gurney's book or Gurney's collection of hymns. We stop short there. But what Sumanyu has done is to trace this quotation back to its original source in a poem that was published in 1861 in Queenslander magazine. And the name of that poem was William Tell. He's actually the hero of Swiss nationalism. So I would like you to, before this book came out, it was published in as an article in EPW, Economic and Political Weekly.
Thank you, Himansu. You pointed out 2 aspects of my study in this book. Two points. One is the emergence of ruchi and its impact on the writers. Because of this, we always analyze Indradhanu Bijli controversy as a controversy related to, Radhanath kind of aesthetic and Upendra Vanja kind of aesthetic. Upendra Vanja was not that old. He was, dubbed Prachin. And we stopped short there. But why did this emerge? There is an elaborate analysis of the historical context. Why did this happen? And the first 7 or 8 attempts to write novel, earliest attempts, most of them were unfinished fragments, but one, Padmamali, she has just left, she has translated Padmamali, came before Fakirmon. They're all historical novels. It's very interesting to see that these novels were historical. There is a reason. So everywhere there is a reason. And that is because traditional literature was imaginative. Radhanath says we Odias only value the magical and the fantastic. We don't look at what is the real. So about Kalidas, we have no evidence of what kind of a person he was. No realistic details are there. They are all highly, everything is magical. Even late 19th century, we are talking about Bhima Bhoi. Again, miraculous, he recovered his eyesight or, all kinds of things. So, very similitude, the essence of realism in literature or fiction, which had emerged by the 18th century in England, or even earlier, somehow most of these writers thought if we write historical novels, then only we can think of the real world. Because if we are talking about gods and goddesses, rajas, queens and princesses, then we'll have to go beyond realism. We cannot stick to realism. So historical novel, again Walter Scott in England, Bankim in Bengal, and then all these writers, they started writing historical novel. And what you pointed out is an essential, this is why Sahitya, in Odia aesthetics or Sanskrit aesthetics, Naika Rupa Varnan. There are whole chapters in Sudarshan Acharya's book, Odia Kavya Kausala, where he is talking about what is this, Naika Rupa Varnan. So these writers, look at the hybridity. These writers have appropriated the European genre of the novel, prose fiction. But there also they want to plant the Indian aesthetic, rasa, dhvani, all that, and Naika Rupa Varna. Now Naika Rupa Varna, as it so happened when they were writing these novels, Indradhanu was championing the cause of Upendra Bhanja and Bijuli was opposed to it. So there was a lot of controversy. Now these writers thought we should not take the risk of following Naika Rupa Varna. In these novels, fragmentary as well as complete, they begin by describing the novel, the Naika, but then they also stop. Fakirmon is not the first one. But what Fakirmon does is, he uses this term, shall I read out that paragraph?
Just read a bit of that.
Just a bit, just the quotation from Fakirmon, which is well known, but I think it is worth repeating. When the narrator in Fakirmon's Chauman Arthagunta sets out to describe the beauty of the central woman character, I don't call her heroine, he embarks on Naik Rupavan. Then suddenly he stops. This part of the convention was meant to meet an aesthetic requirement, that of Sringaras. We are looking at the contradiction, the hybrid mode of Sahitya now. It is trying to follow the Indian aesthetics, that is Natya Shastra and others, Vishwanath Kaviraj and so on, but the form is European. Then he stops, the narrator stops and says, along with diverse foreign goods, a commodity called Ruchi has been freshly imported to this desa. If you do not take care to keep track of it, you are done for. You will be listed under the category of the stupid and uncultured. So, in order to, at the same time, everyone knows he uses a clever device, he parodies Saraswati, Rupa Varnana and all that, and ultimately he is saying all that he wants to say, but in a parodic mode, so that he could not be caught. Fakirmon being Fakirmon. Then I try to understand why this is happening. Then I see that the use of the term was by Bandyopadhyay, when Rangalal Bandyopadhyay, when he is talking about Rasakollalam. Soon after, John Beams also uses indicts the practice of obscenity in Odia. So I will not read out what Bandyopadhyay says, but look at what John Beams says. Rangalal says all these Odia texts are full of Adirasa. Now this is again something new. Sringar Rasa has suddenly become Adirasa. The way I understand is that extreme eroticism goes beyond simple Sringar to Adi Rasa. Adi is primitive. So there is a lot of value judgment coming in. So idea of Adhunik again. This is how is it not a contradiction? I mean, that is another issue that I take up. The accent on Adirasa that one encounters in the work Rasakallala might upset sympathetic readers with refined ruchi. So this is one of the earliest uses of the term ruchi in the literary sphere. And John Beams first got hold of Rasakallala but had not read it. He just went by what others had said. So he had good things to say about Rasakallala. But after he read it, he said this: in the majority of the instances, these poems are monotonous, childish, and indescribably indecent variations on the leading features of the Bhagavat Purana. The Rasakallala is one of this class, and super adds to the usual impurity of Indian poems on this subject, that special and peculiar revolting obscenity which is the distinguishing characteristic of the Odia mind. So probably he had gone to Puri, Ratha Yatra, and must have heard the Dahuka Gitas, so he's thinking. They are also saying that a time came when there was Ruchi Parivartan. I am saying that there is nothing called a natural Ruchi Parivartan. This was all planted, this was manufactured, otherwise people would have gone on and on. They went on and on with Chandravandu. There was no Ruchi Parivartan. But for the any Bhadralok, this was happening. See, in Bengal, what was happening was this Vartala publication, those of you who are familiar with Bengali, 19th century Bengali, Vartala came up with obscene publications. But before that, traditionally, there was no obscenity of the kind, quote unquote, obscenity of the kind that you find in Rasakallala or Chandravandu, Lavanyavati, or this. So, there the censorship, the obscenity laws of England were applied in India first before they were applied in England. So, this is what is happening. So, Fakirmon, the shrewd individual that he was, with a shrewd mind, and he saw that whenever we talked about good literature, good kavya and all that, we saw to it that there was a decent proportion of rasas of all kinds. In the same issue of Utkal Sahitya, where this was serialized under the pseudonym Hujjati, was also carrying pieces about Ruchi. So Fakirmon's mind was, and he himself wrote about Yoga Shastra, Patanjali Yoga Shastra. So I am looking at the constant interaction between the public literary sphere and literature that was emerging then. That is the important part. So he is not saying that this is foreign. What he is saying is that this is important. This is not native. So how did it come? I looked at two aspects. One is Ruchi, as it was used in Vaishnava Dharma, Ruchi. It's about some spiritual aspects. Then in Kaviraj, Ruchi. So जिसको भूख नहीं लग रहा तो उसको कुछ टेस्टी चटनी वगैरह देना है. So chutney becomes, to change the ruchi. तब हमें कहूँ नहीं रुचि सबको रुचु नहीं खाइबटा रुचु. So he is saying if you want to read serious literature and you don't have a taste for it, first look at these chutneys, that is humorous pieces, fun pieces. Then you can go, you will be inducted into that fine taste. So Bhadraloks must have fine taste. These things are coming up. So Fakirmon doesn't like it. So he says, so there is a long discussion how the concept of ruchi comes in. The other one is about Rebati. That's a very long piece actually. I have abridged it here. What I'm saying is that Fakirmon is already a militant. When he's saying that white cranes, they are coming and picking up all the fishes, crows, Odias, kingfishers, Odias, So everywhere, and then he says Sonkhi Bilei, and that's Queen Victoria is seen as Sonkhi Bilei. So there is always a substratum, subversion that you notice in Fakirmon. I am saying that by quietly planting this protest in Swiss nationalism, William Tell is narrated. So once you see the idea of an epigraph, as you all know, in modern practice, T.S. Eliot has done it. So many writers have Konkin is Kapala Kundala had so many epigraphs from Sanskrit and so on and so on. So Fakirmon again uses an epigraph and in English. He was hoping against hope that someone will read the original poem, where there is this military against oppression and Swiss national struggle. So there is a political purpose that the epigraph is serving. I am explaining so many things. And we all know that Fokimoon was friendly with kings, and these newspapers, magazines were coming from all the way from Australia, and it is an Australian paper. So Fokimoon may be waiting in his drawing room and must have seen and flipping through the pages. He had read it. So it's not that Fokimoon was illiterate. We do not get to go into these extra literary aspects. And just one thing though is out of context. There are many illustrations in my book. Every chapter has got related illustrations. In the modernity chapter, we see the first medicine shop in Natak, which is being advertised. Then there is a war of words, advertisements. We have some salsa, from America. Electro salsa. Big advertisement because there was a lot of money, and I looked at how much Uttar Deepika was charging per column. A lot of money. It's a cure for everything. Now the Odia Ayurved Kaviraj, they were also producing their poor fellows medicine, and there were no takers because these are all modern medicines. So they also started advertising. Now what is the function of advertising? You have to invent a new kind of rhetoric. You look at how Odia language changed. What we now call, when we teach undergraduate students of commerce, business English. So that was business Odia. In the advertisements you see them. So when Odia language prose was at its infancy, all these aspects of the public sphere, print culture, they helped the humanities. And you see, they are also saying that if you buy these medicines and get treated, the money that you spend will stay in Odisha. If you buy electrosalsa, it will go to Bengal and then to America. Look at, the protest against globalization.
So they see.
Yeah, so it's very interesting to look at the advertisement. So which is what I have done. Yeah, and beauty care, women. How it's called hairline, for there is a picture illustration. Initially in the 1860s and 70s, they did not have the technology to print sketches. If they got it done, like the masthead of a newspaper, it was done in Calcutta. We didn't have it in Odisha, in Panda. So gradually by 1899, 1900, you find these sketches included, more and more. So, and these luxury items. So all these things are very, fascinating studies that one comes across by looking at the newspapers and periodicals, and not just look at the prose, or rather fiction, poetry, and so on and so forth. And you see, why am I saying this then? Is it a sociological study? No, it is still a study of modern Odia literature. Just one other thing. You find that in the history of Hindi literature, they do not have Adhunik Hindi side. They are talking about Pragativad, Prayogavad, and Chaya. Ramvar Singh has all these. So they are avoiding the term Adhunik. Just as the English poets, the emergence of modern poetry, Robert Graves and Laura Riding, in 1928 they wrote a book. The modern poets themselves did not call their poetry modern poetry, because when this book came out, Laura Riding and Robert Graves, it was called modern poetry. 1920 is when the first use. Then F.R. Lewis's very important book, New Bearings in English Poetry. No, the term modern is not used. New bearings. So in many Indian languages, when Adhunika Sahitya is being discussed, now we are in a soup in Odisha, and this is what I am saying. When we call Radhanath Adhunika Kavi, and we also call Sachi Rautra Adhunika Kavi, and what is that, Kodabhi, Guru Manju, this is also Adhunika Kavi, which is, when we talk about... Khandagiri. What is the other one?
No, that is Kalapur.
Kalapur. So that is also आधुनिक ओडिया कविता जो आमर बहुत पेरोडी कराई क्रिटिसाइज कराई बुझी हबने अबोध्य जोटा सेटा हला आधुनिक देयर इज ए joke about how a poet writes a poem and shows it to his wife, then his wife says it's very good, you know what, you understood it, then she says yes, no wait, then she cuts out a few lines here and there and then reads it out. She says I can still understand it but not as well as I understood the first verse. Then she cuts more lines and then when she says that I don't understand a thing about what you have written, then he says yes, now I am a successful. So that modernism in literature is very different from the modernity that I am talking about in the art.
I think we have already talked for about an hour and 20 minutes. Yeah, it's 1 hour. I think we will close it now. So let me thank everybody very warmly for their gracious presence and for their spirited participation in this more than hour-long discussion. And thank you, Sumanyu, for keeping this discussion very warm and yeah, we should continue. But in Amazon it will charge more. So thank you very much.